Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Over the past 6 years, multiple remakes and critically acclaimed sequels have fueled the Resident Evil renaissance. From the revival of classic survival horror in Resident Evil 7 to the reimagining of all-time favorites like Resident Evil 2, this esteemed series has both satiated the desires and fed the appetites of fans craving more zombie-filled goodness. Enter Resident Evil 4 Remake. With the bombshell announcement of the game's release during last June's State of Play, Capcom wasted no time in getting straight to the point and delivering a jaw-dropping first look at the modernized Resident Evil 4 in all its RE engine glory. While some may argue that 4 might not have needed the remake treatment, it is definitely a welcome surprise and is shaping up to be another solid entry in the series. And with that in mind, here are 4 reasons we are absolutely hyped for the Resident Evil 4 remake.
This time, it can be different. It has to.
Any developer working on a third-person shooter after the mid-2000s will tell you that Resident Evil 4 completely revolutionized the survival horror genre and set the bar for all third-person shooters to come. The over-the-shoulder viewpoint and camera controls introduced in RE4 proved to be so innovative that they influenced the gameplay of third-person staples like Grand Theft Auto, Mass Effect, Uncharted, and even The Last of Us, making the industry-wide impact of this change in perspective one that can still be felt to this day. Regarding the Resi franchise, the precise aiming and reflex-based emphasis of this new perspective made the survival horror experience the series was known for that much more intense and terrifying. Much to the dismay of more hardcore fans, doing away with the archaic, stiff, and sometimes cumbersome controls of earlier entries in favor of a more streamlined over-the-shoulder shooting experience did more to help the series as a whole than hinder it. Even the remakes benefit greatly from this third-person shooter style of gameplay, combining pivot-based movement with over-the-shoulder aiming to deliver tense combat experiences where making each shot count meant the difference between life and death. From what we've seen so far in the footage provided by Game Informer, RE4's updated gameplay seems to both honor its roots and improve upon what Capcom has established with prior remakes. Leon can still roundhouse kick enemies after a well-placed shot to the face, but in opposition to the disconnected animations of the original, the remake exploits RE Engine's technical advancements to link each animation together in one continuous and natural movement. The addition of a parry move allows Leon to use a correctly timed block with his knife to keep enemy attacks at bay and even stand a chance against Dr. Salvador's savage chainsaw swings. Knife actions allow Leon to break free from an enemy's grasp, quickly finish off downed combatants, and even prevent Ashley Graham from being carried away. Knife durability transforms what could otherwise be an overpowered tool into a more tactical mechanic whose usage necessitates discretion on the part of the player. The inclusion of stealth mechanics allows Leon to sneak past certain enemies and adds a strategic element to gameplay, allowing players to take either a covert or aggressive approach to each encounter. Combine all this with smooth frame pacing, 6 different control schemes, and vastly improved AI mechanics, the Resi 4 remake could follow in the footsteps of its predecessor to become another revolutionary third-person shooter.
A most warm welcome to my castle, Mr. Kennedy.
From stylish spy Ada Wong to short-fused noble Ramon Salazar, each of the characters met along Leon's journey in Resident Evil 4 stood out remarkably in their own right due to their signature styles and the role each individual played in the story. Each interaction with them was cinematic and memorable, with portrayals akin to something straight out of a mid-2000s blockbuster. Even some of the lesser bosses, like Dr. Salvador and El Gigante, were so quintessential to the experience that it's hard to imagine a complete remake without them. Fortunately, aside from Leon S. Kennedy and his iconic leather jacket, the eclectic ensemble of heroes and villains from the original game are also returning on March 23rd. Lewis's Oscar Isaac-like appearance will have players of all genders wanting him to call them Señorita, and it's safe to say Ada Wong will elicit similar feelings during both Leon and her own Separate Ways storyline. While Capcom will likely expand upon many of these roles to allow each character to truly shine, the question remains regarding how the darker tone of the remake will shape their portrayals. What sort of behaviors and quirks will Capcom retain for each character? Will Salazar still chastise Leon for remarks about his Napoleon-esque stature? Will Lewis still make offhanded, inappropriate comments about Ashley's assets?
How rude!
Will Ada still whisper sweet nothings to Leon any chance she gets? And most importantly, will Ashley still want Leon to do some overtime?
Sorry.
We remain eager to see how these interactions will play out in the remake, and hope that Capcom chooses to stay close to the spirit of the original dialogue. Of course, it wouldn't be the true RE4 experience without the beloved and ever-present merchant.
Got something that might interest you.
This mysterious yet endearing hooded figure has arguably become the poster child for all merchant-type characters in video games since his introduction, and the original game simply would not have remained in our collective consciousness for this long without his presence. Fortunately, recent clips from the remake show that the level of interactability with this character has expanded to include performing additional side quests for him and an overhauled in-game store, opening the door for even more lines of dialogue delivered in his gruff and iconic Australian accent.
You can't go wrong with that.
With all that, we certainly have a lot to look forward to when we finally get to drop by the shop with our friendly neighborhood merchant come launch day. Resident Evil 4 is credited with revolutionizing the survival horror genre, completely reworking the gameplay and ensuring that the game's descendants were far more approachable to potential players, in turn leading to better sales figures for Capcom. Gone were the archaic tank controls, stiff shooting mechanics, and painstaking backtracking that typified the Resident Evil experience of the previous console generation in favor of a more linear and streamlined survival horror experience, with an emphasis on survival through quick, decisive actions and brutal force instead of careful ammo and inventory management. However, as we would later discover, this shift was both for better and for worse. Unlike previous games, where much of the horror was the result of resource scarcity, enemy brutality, and the anxiety created by cumbersome controls and restrictive camera angles, Resident Evil 4 gave players greater power and the ability to face their fears head-on. Things like free 360-degree aiming and generous item drops meant that players had more control over their situation and the ability to easily turn the metaphorical tables in their favor. While the game tried to retain at least a few horror elements, such as the dreaded quick-time events and certain atmospheric moments in the castle and island portions of the game, it was undeniably a different survival horror experience. All in all, it quickly became apparent that RE4 was more oriented for action than for horror. Fast forwarding a couple of years, Capcom would double down with a pair of third-person action shooter sequels, each of which contained plotlines akin to a stereotypical Hollywood action flick, boulder punching notwithstanding. While Capcom would eventually redeem itself by returning to the survival horror formula with Resident Evil 7 and the RE2 remake, the RE3 make ran into issues similar to those found in RE4 through 6, relying heavily on action set pieces and quick player movement at the expense of the horror fostered by the pursuing nemesis and, everything else from the original game. Recent snippets and trailers of the RE4 remake show that Capcom has learned from past mistakes and is attempting to inject more horror elements into both the gameplay and the atmosphere. The dark and ominous look of the expanded forest and castle areas invoke a sense of tension and dread while traversing through them, and the dark yet vivid color palette on display is a notable improvement from the Gulf War-esque color scheme of grays and browns that characterized both the original RE4 and most other games that came out in the mid to late 2000s. The inclusion of sneaking and crouching mechanics also lend a more familiar horror feel, giving players the ability to sneak past high-risk enemies. The aesthetic alterations to Dr. Salvador, Mendez, Salazar, and Sadler also lend them a terrifying presence more at home with this horror-focused art direction in the remake. Capcom seems to be pulling all the stops to ensure that RE4 Remake is an equally scary and satisfying game to play, striking the right balance between survival horror and action to keep player adrenaline pumping while keeping things spooky all throughout. Simply put, we can't wait to shit our pants all over again as we come face to face with RE4 Remake's horror-inducing enemies and bosses like Marauders, Regenerators, and Verdugo on March 23rd.
Ashley Graham, are you in here?
Just let me go.
Listen.
Oh, Ashley. Hands down, the worst part of the gameplay loop in the original RE4 was babysitting Ashley Graham. No, not that one. A whiny and unbearable 20-something who proved to be more of a liability to the US government than an asset, ballistics aside.
Ow! You pervert!
The parts of the game with Ashley in tow were arguably the weakest aspects of the gameplay as a whole, as players were forced to either use her as a shield while she followed closely behind you, or plop her down to wait in some corner of the map while the player took care of business. Almost all Resi veterans share PTSD from the section of the game where the player had to hide Ashley in this specific corner of the room to have any chance of clearing the Horde of Ganado without her constantly dying. All this is before mentioning how Ashley's screams for help still haunt players like ourselves to this day. With this in mind, we are relieved to see that our experience escorting Ashley won't be as tedious or traumatic as it was in the original game, largely because she's finally developed a self-preservation instinct for the remake. Ashley will no longer just stand in place waiting to get grabbed by Ganado, and will instead spread out to avoid harm at the player's direction. Furthermore, instead of using her futile duck and cover tactic, Ashley now crouches behind cover, allowing her to actually hide and avoid enemy attacks. Better still, she can finally climb down a ladder by herself, something Leon is probably extremely relieved to hear. Ashley's traditional health bar appears to be removed for the remake, in turn reducing the number of annoying and unexpected deaths that would otherwise diminish the RE4 experience. But the biggest improvement so far? The complete absence of her screaming Leon's name at the top of her lungs like a kidnapped child. Instant 10 out of 10, assuming it stays that way come launch day. Gameplay changes aside, footage of Ashley escaping through the dark forest and wandering the haunting halls of the castle suggest more opportunities to actually play as her in the remake. Other clips also suggest that Capcom is taking more creative liberties with her role in the story, showing her succumbing to the mind-controlling effects of the Las Plagas and pointing a gun at Leon, almost as if she's retaliating against the players themselves for years of hatred from the fanbase. To be more serious for a moment, it's reassuring to know that Capcom is addressing most of the issues that players had with Ashley in the original to make her feel like someone standing on more equal footing with Leon in the remake. Empowerment for women aside, we are all for this new, improved, strong, and independent Ashley Graham who don't need no man. Well, most of the time. Anyway. That concludes our hot takes on what we're most excited for in the Resident Evil 4 remake. What characters and features are you most excited to see come launch day? Let us know in the comments, stay tuned for more coverage on Resident Evil 4 post-launch, and be sure to subscribe for more content like this from the classiest cavern on the World Wide Web.